In today's video, we are going to pull back the curtains and look at how b.a.r.e Flower Farm as a business made money in 2024. We're actually going to look at how my business has evolved and talk a little bit more about the fundamentals of recognizing when opportunity knocks on your door and when to chase those opportunities. Because in the past, I've made videos like this, but specifically on how much money I made as a flower farmer. And at this point in year 3, this b.a.r.e Flower Farm enterprise, we'll call it, has evolved to the point where flower sales are actually now a minority percentage of the total income that this farm made. So I wanted to do this video not necessarily talking about the absolute amount of money that I made, but to give people an understanding of how businesses evolve, sometimes without our intending to do so, and how sometimes opportunity knocks on your door and you have to be able to recognize that there's an opportunity, but also know when to chase after them. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that. And if you're new to my channel, my name is Jessie. I grow in Zone 7A in New Jersey. About 3 years ago, my husband and I sought to buy a property where I could chase my dream of basically growing at a much bigger scale than what we were previously growing on, which was a townhouse in container gardening because we had a little bit of a front porch and a deck, and that was about it. So we moved here so that I could chase my dream of flower farming, and in the process, I picked up a camera and started making videos on YouTube, and we're gonna get a little bit more into that. In this video, I'm actually not going to tell you the specific number that b.a.r.e Flower Farm made. It's in the mid 5 figures if you want a proxy. I'm going to talk about percentages, but again, this is really about taking learnings from what I did and hopefully inspiring you to think about other ways to evolve your flower farm and get additional sources of income in ways you may not have thought of. And perhaps if your dream is to do this full time or make a decent side hustle type of income, hopefully this gives inspiration to you. So let's dig in right into the numbers, and we're gonna start with the easiest part, which is how much I made through flower farming and selling flowers. So in 2024, flower sales made up 30% of the total b.a.r.e Flower Farm income. This is a huge contrast to the last 2 years where flower sales were basically like 85–95% of my total revenue from b.a.r.e Flower Farm. The sales in 2024 came from a mix of wholesale and retail. And if you've been following me, you'll know that I made this intentional shift to go towards wholesale in the beginning of the year. After my daughter was diagnosed, we ended up shifting a little bit more to retail just because I didn't have the time and the capacity to sell at the local cooperative that I was a part of. So ultimately, that mix ended up being 55% wholesale and 45% retail. So wholesale, again, consists of selling at the cooperative, but it also consists of selling directly to florists who picked up on farm, as well as shipping to florists, especially during the winter season when I had winter tulips. When we look at the retail side, there were a bunch of different things that factored into this mix. I had a once a month CSA. I was selling consistently at a local retail shop that was close by. I did one farmer's market on Mother's Day. I did a bouquet bar. So there's a hodgepodge of things that ultimately get to this 30%. And I would say that before E's diagnosis, that split was actually more 70% wholesale and 30% retail. So in the course of like 2.5 months, you can see how much it significantly shifted over to retail. And high level takeaways in terms of flower sales, I was really proud. I ended up growing more flowers than I thought I was going to be able to grow. I had actually done a Patreon post looking specifically at my wholesale numbers, and through that, I broke down that I grew 20 varieties or flowers for wholesale. If you add retail, we're looking at about 24 varieties. We're looking at about 50 cultivars. So I grew a lot of flowers. I was pretty proud for someone who was just in year 3 with very limited growing experience before, the amount of progress that I had made in growing. And I really need to give a shout out to the amount of learning and growth that I learned at the co-op that I was selling at, Jersey Cut Flower, market. These are experienced growers that I was surrounded by. Some of them were completely full-time growers who had been growing for years and I learned tons from, but there were also some part-time growers who were growing at an amount that was probably at least 3 to 4 times what I was growing at, and also juggling that full-time job. Now, one of the growers that I'm thinking about right now doesn't have children. So, when you take that out of the mix, obviously there's a little bit more time. But what I love about seeing what good looks like is it tells me how much more I have to go in terms of opportunity. So those are my flower sales, and that's about it in terms of flower related stuff we're going to talk about in this video, because now we're going to talk about the other 70% of where the b.a.r.e. Flower Farm revenue came from. So I want to take a step back here and tell you a little bit about why I got into flower farming, because this is going to set the context for what I'm going to talk about. I got into flower farming not because I love flowers. I did have a hobby and a growing love for growing things, but it wasn't necessarily rooted in flowers. In fact, I would say that my current passion today still lies within growing food. But what I really loved about flowers was knowing that if you had a little patch in your backyard, even if it wasn't super big, you were making an impact on your local ecosystem. You were potentially creating a space, a haven for things like birds, pollinators, in a place that would have been an ecological desert, aka grass, had you not grown all these flowers and vegetables. And overall, I started realizing that, hey, if I could sell to florists, especially those that were doing weddings, then I could really make an impact on sustainability. And when I started flower farming, and even today, my husband and I care very deeply about sustainability. We care deeply about creating a more sustainable today so that our kids and the future generations can have a more sustainable tomorrow. So that's really the full reason why I came into growing. So I mentioned this because I watched a lot of YouTube videos, especially when we lived in a townhouse where there wasn't a lot to do outside, but it was also during COVID. And the algorithm fed me all of these gardening videos, as well as content from flower farmers, including 2 of my favorite, Nicole from Flower Hill Farm, as well as Serena and then Ian from You Can't Eat the Grass. And through their content, I started learning all the different types of flowers. When I started flower farming, I noticed from all the YouTubing that I had done that there were 2 clear gaps in the content space on YouTube. One, there was a lack of content created for regenerative flower farming. And I think today there's a little bit more, especially from b.a.r.e. of Blossom and Branch. I don't even know she existed back then, and I just wasn't fed her content. I couldn't really find anything about it. I felt that there was a lot more in the vegetable space, but not in the flower farming world. But I was clearly not at all able to talk about this because I hadn't done any growing yet. And the second gap in content I found was content around the business side of flower farming. I loved seeing all of the markets that Serena was doing with Ian. I loved seeing all of the CSA and the bouquets that Nicole was doing on her farm, but I never really saw content from anyone talking about, okay, like this is how much time and effort it took to grow this. This is how much I'm selling the bouquet for. This is how much money I'm making at the end of the day. I come from a business background. I went to an undergraduate business school. I have a love for understanding businesses. So it was natural to me to have this curiosity at a time when I didn't even think about flower farming for myself. So that's why when I started going down the road of flower farming, it occurred to me, hey, if I am going to pick up the camera, I need to be talking about something that is of value because there is a gap in the market. So herein lies the part where I want to emphasize, I recognize the gap, I recognize that I could fill the gap, and then I sought to fill that gap. And anytime there is a gap that you see, the thing you have to ask yourself is it worth chasing after? And is it something that I can chase after? If the answer is yes, then you should go ahead and do it. So more on that later. But now let's actually talk about how chasing after that gap completely changed the course of b.a.r.e. Flower Farm. Because That brings me to revenue stream number 2. Over the past 3 years, I worked really hard to build this YouTube channel. That has culminated to nearly 1.5 million views, equating to 189,000 watch hours. When I did the calculation to see how many watch hours that was in years, it came out to 21.5 years, which honestly blows my mind that collectively people have spent 21.5 years watching what I have to say. And I will admit that when I first started out, I was a little skeptical as to whether or not people cared about what I had to say related to business as well as my numbers, but clearly there was an interested audience who was craving that type of information. So I continued onwards, and here we are today. We're making a video talking literally about money. So let's talk a little bit more about just how I make money off of YouTube. So the traditional way of making money off of YouTube is ad revenue. And what happens is you watch a video, before or during that video, you're gonna see an ad. YouTube is the one that is doing the work going out to advertisers to see if they want to pay for placements in videos. And so YouTube will give me 55% of whatever that advertiser pays, and YouTube takes 45%. I actually think that's a really fair deal given the amount of work that YouTube has to do. So ad revenue is one piece. There is also another piece around affiliate links. And I don't do a lot of affiliate links. So, we're talking about like a couple $100s. And because all of it is from Amazon, there are small businesses on Amazon that I do like to support. But overall, I think it's kind of funny that we promote products to buy off of Amazon, but we're small businesses. So all this to say, I end up donating the money that I get from affiliate links on Amazon. And then the more important part, though, is about 1.5 years ago, I launched a Patreon. I launched a Patreon primarily because of two things. One, there were definitely some videos and content that didn't make sense for general YouTube, but made sense for a more dedicated group of people who were really interested in flower farming content. And so I wanted a channel or platform to be able to showcase that type of information. But two, YouTube ad revenue is very unpredictable. It tends to be a bit seasonal as you get towards later parts of the year where it's holiday season. The ad revenue goes up because advertisers have to pay more to compete for that space, especially at a time of year when everyone's trying to push holiday goods. In January, the ad revenue tends to be really, really low, even if your content is phenomenal. So all to say that ad revenue can be unpredictable, and it's obviously dependent on the cadence in which a creator is uploading videos. So for those two reasons, I chose to launch a Patreon. And my goal with both YouTube and Patreon is to democratize access as it relates to the business of flower farming. I don't think people should be paying 6 figures for an MBA type of education for something that really should be free in this day and age. So I hope that my videos are of value for people out there who may not have had business backgrounds or experiences. And I hope that if you're a Patreon member, you feel that the $5 a month gives you value way in excess of what you're paying for. Because really the goal is to keep that membership as low as possible, because the collective group is paying enough for me to be able to create that content on Patreon. I would also be remiss if I didn't thank my Patreon members, because you guys not only make it possible for me to create content, but you are effectively subsidizing the free content that most other people get to see on this channel, because now we're at a point where making content really has become a priority of b.a.r.e Flower Farm, especially given the amount of revenue that it generates. So with that all said, let's talk about how much YouTube and Patreon contributed to the final 2024 income of b.a.r.e Flower Farm, and it is 12%. So that number might actually be a little bit lower than what you expected given everything that I just talked about. So you might be asking yourself, well, if flowers were 30% and Patreon was 12%, that's only 42%. Where is the other 56% coming from? And so that leads me into the last bucket, which is really the best example of recognizing gaps and chasing after them. I realized about a year and a half into flower farming that there are a ton of gaps in flower farming, for flower farmers especially. I laugh because I have friends from business school who lament that there are no easy businesses to start these days. And I'm like, just come into the flower farming world where we are still not buying stuff through an online website. Sometimes we have to call stuff in. Sometimes we have to go through a sales rep. Sometimes we have to do things by email. I can't always load invoices from suppliers that I'm buying from. I don't even know what I'm being charged for shipping, right? Like there's so much opportunity in the flower farming world. But the specific gap that I noticed was that there was no offering for that medium or small size flower farmer who didn't want to take on wholesale quantities, but obviously didn't want to pay retail prices for things like bulbs and corms. So if you could not take on 500 tulip bulbs, 400 lily bulbs, or 100 or 500 corms of the same exact color or variety, you were basically relegated to paying more or less wholesale prices for those types of items. So I recognized that was a gap. I realized I could fill that gap, and I sought to fill out that gap. That gap is what accounted for 56% of my business, reselling bulbs and corms. So I want to take this example and use it to illustrate for you how to assess whether or not an opportunity is worth chasing after. Before I do that, I want to talk about two truths as it relates to opportunities. The first truth is that most people don't have a hard time recognizing opportunity. And we know this because anytime there's a problem, people are very quick to offer answers and solutions, but sometimes those answers and solutions aren't fully thought through, because when you think through, okay, like in order for me to get to that type of result or answer that you're talking about, I need to go through XYZ, which a lot of times is just not feasible or possible. So people are full of ideas when there is a gap, but what most people have a hard time doing is acting upon that opportunity. And so that also includes figuring out what gaps they can solve and what gaps are worth solving. That leads me to truth number 2, which is that the harder opportunities are the ones that fewer people want to chase after because of two specific reasons. One, there is either a expertise that is required to be able to chase after that opportunity, or two, there is some sort of capital outlay or cash outlay that is prohibitive in terms of allowing people to chase after that opportunity. So let's talk about how this applies to reselling bulbs and corms for wholesale light quantities, is what I'll call it. I was confident that I could meet this gap because I had a prior side hustle e-commerce company primarily selling soaps and candles. And because I was an e-commerce company, I did a lot of shipping. And shipping from the outset sounds relatively straightforward, but shipping can be really complicated, especially when you start doing it at scale. There's a difference between shipping something that's under a pound, shipping something that's like 1 to 20 pounds, shipping something that's above 20 pounds. Add into the mix if something's perishable or not perishable, you get the point. There are a lot of factors to consider when it comes into shipping. Just to give you a little bit of the behind the scenes in terms of what this shipping stuff entails, I have memberships with FedEx, UPS, as well as USPS to get discounted rates. This allows me to be able to offer the lowest and reasonable shipping rates. Again, one of the things that I really dislike is the fact that when I order bulbs and corms, I typically have no idea how much I'm going to be on the hook for shipping, and it isn't until the product is sent out that I know how much I'm paying for shipping. And that brings me to this other piece, which is figuring out the precise shipping that the customer has to pay for on the website upon checkout that is going to match with what I am going to be paying out for shipping. That was a pretty big hurdle for me to figure out during this round of shipping, but I figured it out. And that is one of those things that falls into the expertise bucket, especially within technology. So if you had somehow been overestimated in shipping and overpaid, I actually refunded you. And you would have seen that through an email. There's also the piece around optimal packaging. You know, when you think about bad packaging, Bad packaging is when you use too big of a box for a specific product. And what happens is if you have enough boxes, you're going to take up a ton of extra space on a truck or transportation vehicle that could have been optimized with a much smaller box. So if you're shipping thousands of boxes, you might even be requiring an extra vehicle when you could have had just one vehicle to ship. So that's more at a principle that I want to make sure that the boxes are optimized. And so for the most part, if you bought bulbs and corms from me, hopefully you felt that the boxes were adequately sized. And remember, I have to buy enough boxes in wholesale quantities to make sure that I am getting a low enough pricing, but also have those boxes match with the popular combinations of varieties of bulbs and corms that people are going to buy. So there's this delicate balance, and it's like a science and an art at the same time that you have to figure out. The last thing is that fulfilling large amounts of these bulbs and corms, especially since they're perishable, is a pretty big undertaking. I received the bulbs or the corms, and right away, our goal is to get out these packages to people who pre-order them. And my goal was to get them out to people within 10 days, that they would leave our pole barn within 10 days. So I had friends and family who, upon E's diagnosis, was like, how can I help you? And I said, honestly, the best way you can help me right now is by helping me fulfill these orders. A bunch of fellow flower farmers and watchers on YouTube came out to support our family during this time, and the least I can do is make sure I get out this product to them on time. So I hope that if you ordered from me, you felt like you got that in a reasonable time. If anything was delayed, it was honestly more because I got it late from the supplier than what was originally communicated to me. But I had assembly lines created, different people showed up, so meaning that we are all wired differently. So when we were making mixed bags of ranunculus corms, wanted to make sure that we were also having accuracy in those bags. So we made this little grid here that people would put corms on and then slide into the bag. Like, all of this does require a level of mental effort. I say this because it's not rocket science to figure all of this out. Honestly, anyone can do it. It takes effort. But I think that number two, the outlay of capital is probably also something else that is preventing a lot of people from doing this. In order for me to sell at the quantities that I did and at the lower price points, I had to front out close to $25,000 worth of cash. So remember, I'm committing for this quantity of corms up front without being absolutely sure that I'm going to sell it. And if I don't commit to this certain level, I'm not going to get the minimum price breaks, right? So you can start off with a few thousand, but your margins are going to be lower. So this ability for me to outlay the cash up front, because I have things like YouTube income, Patreon income, as well as selling flowers, really helped me in this part of the business to be able to do all of this debt-free. I'm putting this out there. This gap still exists. Next year, I'm not selling any lily bulbs because I'm not going to be growing lilies outside of those that I perennialized. I don't even know if I'm going to be selling tulip bulbs, but this opportunity exists for anyone who is interested in doing this. And I think it's also worth to say that while certain opportunities exist and you can chase after them, you also need to assess for yourself, does it bring you joy? And I can tell you, shipping corms and bulbs does not bring me joy. So I can see myself doing this on a relatively small scale. It is not something I would ever go into full-time business for. And I want to take a pause here and say a huge thank you to everyone who came out and supported our family by buying bulbs and corms when E was diagnosed, because we really did use the proceeds from those sales in her treatment. We hired an integrative oncology specialist. We hired a dietitian in that same package. A lot of the supplements that she takes are not cheap. There's this like one thing that was like close to $200 for a 60-day supply. So all of your support really did end up making its way to E's treatment. And we also donated a couple $1,000s to Flowers for E, which is a study that E is on right now. And if you're interested in perhaps donating that, I will put that in the description below. And so just rounding out the financial part of this, I I think it's surprising for a lot of people to hear that a lot of YouTubers don't make the majority of their money off of ad revenue. They make the majority money off of either brand sponsorships, so getting a company to sponsor a video, or off of merch or merchandise. So some people have like hats and shirts. I happen to have bulbs as my merch. And so this leads me to the last part of the video, which is really around if you are someone who is looking for opportunity and looking to perhaps supplement your flower farm business with an income stream that is not just selling flowers or on-farm workshops, what could that look like? A lot of people think that today, hey, I need to be a content creator on YouTube to make money. And I just don't think that's the case. I want to give you two clear examples of fellow flower farmers who have figured out other gaps, completely not in content creation. So one of them is Sally. She realized that there are a lot of smaller farmers who want wraps, and that literally the craft wrap is a good way of advertising and standing out. So she ended up creating this beautiful wrap that you can see over here, and it just says locally grown, and I really like it. So she started testing this, sending it out to other flower farmers to test, and now she actually has a viable product that she's selling. I will put her link in the description below if you're interested in buying from her. Patreon members, look out, there's going to be a discount code for you guys if you guys want to buy from Sally. And Sally did not pay me to say this. I genuinely like the product, and I'm using it when I'm giving my winter tulips to the nurses and doctors that are treating E. A second person here is Katrina, who is seemingly tech savvy. She uses something called Notion, which helps her plan. And she noticed that there were no Notion templates for helping flower farmers either crop plan, track harvests, or whatever it is. So if you are a Notion user and you are looking for a template like this, you might also want to check out Katrina's offering when it is available. So I believe right now she's still beta testing, but this will be eventually available. So these are two examples of everyday flower farmers who recognized a gap and decided that it was worth chasing after that gap. And again, this has nothing to do with content creation. And so I want to give you three other examples of former flower farmers that may not have hit it out of the park initially, but eventually hit it out of the park. And it all started with recognizing the first opportunity, realizing that, hey, like maybe that didn't work, so I'm going to go on to the second opportunity that I recognize, and so forth. So one of them is Amelia from Rooted Farmers. If you're on the East Coast, you sell through a cooperative or you're selling wholesale, this is an online software platform that basically streamlines the administrative burden of selling to multiple florists. So you don't have to keep track of inventory manually, even though you're talking to multiple florists. So if you only have like 50 stems of a certain type of flower and you're talking to 3 florists, you can avoid the situation where all 3 florists want to buy and you run out of inventory because this is all managed online. So Amelia recognized that this is a gap. She did not have the expertise to meet the gap on her own, so she hired a software engineer to be able to do it. And obviously she also needed to figure out how to come up with the cash outlay to do it. Is it a perfect platform? No, but it certainly works. Our cooperative used it and it was amazing. It eliminated the need for a lot of manual work. Another great example of a flower farmer who has really taken things to the next level is Linda DeArco from Little Farmhouse Flowers and now the owner of Ampersand Bulbs. Linda started off growing flowers for weddings, selling retail, then getting involved in a tulip workshop. She helped scale the tulip workshop to a virtual option during COVID. Then she recognized that there was just a general gap in high quality educational content for flower farmers, especially when it came to growing things. So she did that. She then figured out, hey, like there's some other things related to education, like shipping. She has a pro platform, which I'm a member of. I took her shipping class. And then she recognized that, hey, like I want to force winter tulips, but there's not a lot of variety out there for pre-chilled tulips. And the industry isn't hearing me. The industry isn't even necessarily breeding with the interests of flower farmers in mind. So I'm going to go out and I'm going to deal directly with growers and be my own bulb supplier. That is huge risk. That is a huge amount of capital outlay and a huge amount of expertise needed, because you're going to a completely different type of business here. But she did it. And so far, I feel like from the outside, people are supporting her. People are really, really appreciative of the fact that there is a flower farmer voice, right? And so I am always in awe of just how far and how quickly her initiatives have come. And I'm really excited to see just, where this goes in the next few years. My final example is Erin Benzakein of Floret Farms, which most people know Floret. And if you think about it, Erin also started out growing flowers on a very small plot, expanded that plot, grew for grocery stores, realized that there was a lack of education, and she was able to scale it in a way that became the Floret online workshops. And so tons of people, like thousands of people now take her workshops. Then she inadvertently got into the filming industry when she was the topic of the Growing Floret series, but it sounded like that meaning her and her husband, started getting more into film production. So now they actually have someone who is a producer working for Floret, making films and good high quality content that goes onto YouTube and their own platforms. And so you can see that Floret just has gone through these multiple iterations by chasing after different opportunities. And now she's in the world of breeding, because similar to Linda, she saw that the breeders weren't listening to flower farmers, weren't listening to the needs of what local flower palettes need to look like, especially if we were going to sell to wedding designers and event work. So she decided to do something about it, and she started breeding her own flowers. Again, different level of expertise needed in order to do that. She had to bring people in order to make that happen. And two, even though there is a huge cash outlay, there's an even bigger outlay of capital in the form of time. So she launched her new zinnia varieties last year in Celosia, and it was like a 7-year waiting time frame before she got to that stage. So again, huge amounts of investment. If you look at Linda and Erin, each of those women went through 4 or 5 iterations at the minimum. Each time they chased after a new opportunity, I would go as far to say that they almost reinvented themselves. And while they didn't necessarily reinvent their business, they had to significantly shift how their business operated and really jump out of a plane and build a parachute at the same time. So for those reasons, I highly respect them as entrepreneurs and not just flower farmers. And this brings me to the end of this video, which is there are some of us who came into flower farming just wanting to grow flowers for the love of growing flowers and wanting to sell that as a little side hustle for a few $100s, maybe a few $1,000s a year. There are some of us who come into this wanting to quit our full-time jobs and wanting to do this full-time. And there are probably a minority, but still a few people out there who want to do something really, really big. And what I'm here to tell you is that no matter what camp you belong in, you should always be assessing the opportunities and the gaps in front of you. And even if you are that person who isn't looking to make this a full-time thing and more of a side hustle, I can guarantee you that if you have multiple ways of bringing in income for your flower farm, it's actually going to make growing flowers more enjoyable, because it's going to be less stressful for you, because you're not just relying on selling flowers as that one source of income. And of course, this applies even more so if you are looking at doing this full time. The best types of businesses are those that are diversified in a way that cash flow is consistently coming in. They're not always relying on the same type of audience, so that if something were to happen to that one type of customer, for example, there's a recession and people are no longer doing these elaborate weddings and you're only selling to florists, then you still have a plan B in terms of who you're selling to, right? So the best types of businesses are the ones that are able to meet a gap in the industry and figure out a way to address that gap and monetize from that gap. So I'm going to end this video by saying 2024 was a really tough year for our family personally. But when I reflect back, it was a year of tremendous growth for me, especially as an entrepreneur. I mentioned I had this prior side hustle soap company. I didn't get to these revenue numbers until around like year 6. So to be able to get to those revenue numbers in half the amount of time was a proud thing for me to be able to reflect upon. For me, doing all this stuff is honestly less about the money. Like, obviously, money makes life easier. I am lucky enough that I have a great full-time job that I enjoy and pays well enough that right now we have what we need. We're not extravagant spenders by any means. So I feel very content with what we have. And the money that comes from b.a.r.e Flower Farm is good, but it's not about the money. It's actually more about the pursuit of being better and improving myself as a person. So a heartfelt thank you for those of you who have followed me, supported me throughout this entire journey. I try to reply to every single comment. Sometimes I just don't have the capacity, but I do read every single one of them. I know in 2025, this channel is still going to be producing content related to the business of flower farming, but we are also going to go into a new direction, which is growing food. And because this upcoming year, I'm still going to be very involved and invested in ease treatment and hopefully more on the recovery side, there's going to be much more emphasis placed on growing our own food. And with that also means selling less flowers and therefore less of this stress around needing to grow a certain amount of flowers. So I feel like this channel might even become more fun. I'm going to be doing more experiments. So hopefully giving you all reason to continue to follow. And again, thank you to everyone. And in the meantime, here is the latest update on E.